Okay, so now we just need to go through and talk about when you use the preterite and when you use the imperfect. And I'm just going to kind of go over what your book says and look at what another book says, and then I'm going to give you some tools that I think may help you most easily figure it out. So the preterite tense presents information as an event. Ayer llovió. Okay, so when you're talking about the preterite versus the imperfect, again, if you're just trying to tell what the weather was like yesterday, you would use the preterite. But if you were trying to set up you were trying to set up the background, create a mood before you actually give important information, then you would use your weather in the imperfect. For example, fuimos al cine por la noche y al salir, well, that one actually is different. But anyway, so if I think I gave the example before, it was a dark and stormy night when I heard a knock at the door. The knock at the door is in the preterite. The weather is in the imperfect because the weather is not what I'm trying to convey to you. I'm using it to create a mood. But if I just wanted to say yesterday it rained, then that is the information that I'm trying to convey to you. So, ayer por la noche estuvimos en un restaurante muy bueno. Last night we were in a very good restaurant. That yesterday at night or last night, that when you see words like that, and I'll give you a whole list of them, you tend to want to put something in the preterite because that implies it's an event that's already started in the past and it's over and done with, okay? The imperfect tense sets the background to an action that is expressed in the preterite tense. So that's what I was trying to say. It was a dark and stormy night when I heard a knock at the door. So it was setting up that scenario. Here, fuimos al cine por la noche y al salir llovía. So the important information that you're trying to convey to someone is not that it was raining, it's that you went to the movies, and then you're setting up you're creating the mood. The rain was setting the mood for the information you're getting ready to tell, which is about going to the movies. So that's why it's in the imperfect. Estábamos en un restaurante muy bueno y llegó Rogelio. So when you're setting up what you're in the middle of doing and then there's kind of like an interruption, you tend to put that you use what you were in the middle of doing in the imperfect, and then you put the interruption into the preterite. So we were at a very good restaurant and Rogelio arrived. Or like we were at a really good restaurant when Rogelio arrived. He interrupted it, what you were in the middle of doing. Okay. To demonstrate the consequences of an action, we can use... Okay, so this is still not preterite or imperfect, so we will stop here. And let me pull up some more stuff for you guys to look at. Okay, so this comes from another book, but might help explain it as well. In Spanish, the use of the preterite and the imperfect reflects the way the speaker views the action or event being expressed in the past. A comparison of their use as follows. The preterite narrates actions or events in the past that the speaker views as completed or finished. Just make that a little bit bigger. Okay, so Victoria y Lucia hablaron por teléfono por 2 horas. So having a time delineation in your statement lets people know that it was started and finished in the past. So when I said Victoria y Lucia hablaron por teléfono por 2 horas, when I have that time delineation, that lets me know that it's over and done with, it's completed. I tend to put it into the preterite. It expresses the beginning or the end of a past event or action. El zapatero llegó a las 5. So here's a time frame in which he arrived, so I know. And also arriving, you can't really do that repeatedly unless you were saying, like, you know, I always used to arrive at school late. Then you can put that into the imperfect. But most of the time, if you're talking about I arrived at school late this morning, or he arrived on time to the party, or she arrived at 10 o'clock to the class, that's going to be in the preterite. La película terminó a las 8 de la noche. Again, the film finished at 8 o'clock at night, and that time lets us know that that if you see that time delineation, you're going to want to put it into the preterite. And words like terminar, finalizar, empezar, comenzar, so words that by their definition mean beginning and end, tend to go into the preterite. It narrates completed events that occurred in a series. I don't know why they have to mention that, but if a bunch of things already happened in the past, then you can just put them all into the preterite. Changes in mental, physical, and emotional conditions. So Most of the time, these mental, physical, and emotional conditions, those states of being verbs that I mentioned in the last video, like want, need, etc., they tend to go into the imperfect. However, if you know that a person no longer feels a particular way, you can put it in the you should put it in the preterit. So Alejandra, and also when you use ponerse, because you can use ponerse to say that a person became a certain emotion, became furious, became sad, became happy. Okay. So, ponerse, you always put ponerse into the preterit because that's that's a start in an emotion. But here, estuve nerviosa durante la entrevista, if you put something like during the interview, then you know that the person is no longer nervous. You gave a frame in which they felt that way, a time frame. Okay, and we've already talked about the weather multiple times. If you're just telling what the weather is, or what the weather was, what the weather was yesterday, last week, etc., it goes into the preterit. It goes into the imperfect when you're setting a scene. But so when the information you're trying to convey to someone is what the weather was, then you use the preterit. If what the information you're trying to convey is something else, but you just want to set a scene, you're getting ready to tell more of a story, then you put the weather into the imperfect. Okay. The imperfect describes what was happening in the past, usually in relationship to another event or at a given time with no reference to the beginning or end of an action. So, Rosa hablaba mientras miraba las compras. So you're just saying Rosa was talking while she was looking at her purchases. So whenever you have ing progressive tense, if you're trying to say something in the ing or if you can translate it ing, then you're going to want to use the imperfect. And you can see how these over here had, for 2 hours, at 5, at 8. You don't see any of that over here, so there's no time delineation. It gives no reference to when it began or ended, and so that's why it's in the imperfect. Also, if the action was repeatedly, if there are time phrases, but those time phrases aren't things like for 2 hours, at 5 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, yesterday. If it's things like every Saturday, every week, always, then you put it into the imperfect because it implies repetition. When you tell the hour, so time, if there's time in the sentence, the other verb, the verb not related to giving the hour, gets put into the imperfect. But when you give the hour, when you're saying it was 11 o'clock, it was 2 o'clock, it was 3 o'clock, you have to use the imperfect tense to give the hour. And you use the imperfect tense when you give your age. Like you would never say tuve 6 años, you'd say teníamos, tenía 6 años. Most mental, physical, and emotional states, your states of being verbs, go into the preterit unless you're using ponerse to give your emotion, or you've got some sort of something that expresses that feeling is no longer in play. But most of the time, your physical and emotional conditions, you're going to put in the imperfect. And then lastly, they go together. What you're in the middle of doing, you put in the imperfect and you put your interruption into the preterit. So, conversábamos con el dependiente cuando Lourdes entró en la joyería. So, we were talking with the salesperson when Lourdes came into the jewelry shop. Or las chicas salían de la tienda cuando Jorge las vio. So, the girls were leaving the store when Jorge saw them. Okay? Okay, so something else that I try to give students to help them decide when to use the preterite or the imperfect is this, and I'll make this available to you guys. You ask yourself this question: is the verb in the sentence an action verb or a state of being verb? If your answer is that it's an action verb, then you ask yourself, does the action have a definite beginning and end, or is it an action that occurred repeatedly in the past? If it has a definite beginning and end, use the preterite. And these are words that get associated with the preterite. So if in your sentence you see ayer, anteayer, anoche, el otro día, esta mañana, etc., then you know it had a definite beginning and end, and you would use the preterite. If it occurred repeatedly, and these are words that would imply repeatedly, these words cada semana, a menudo, cada día, cada año, they imply repetition. And so you would use, for that action verb, you would use the imperfect. If you go back up here, is the verb in the sentence an action verb or a state of being verb? You already dealt with the actions. If it is a state of being verb, you're going to use the imperfect unless you know for a fact that the subject is no longer in that state, or if it's that ponerse for the emotions. Then you could ask yourself also, was the subject in the middle of doing something when he or she was interrupted? If that's the case, then the interruption you put in the preterit and what you're in the middle of doing in the imperfect. You could also ask yourself if the verb in question is in the past progressive. Is it ing? If it's some sort of ing, then you're going to put imperfect. Like if you were saying was walking, was dancing, was singing. If that's what the sentence is trying to convey, it's going to be the imperfect. Are you giving the hour, telling time? If that's yes, then use the imperfect. Okay, so here's just a couple of examples we can do really quickly. Let me see here. And we'll probably do this in class as well, but okay. So here, if you're looking at this particular activity, this one's in English, we just kind of want to figure out whether we would use the preterit or the imperfect here. So it says, I arrived late at my office this morning. This verb is an action verb, and so we look to see if there's anything that says that it occurred repeatedly. It does not. It has this morning in there, and this morning means that it's over and done with. And so you would use the preterit to express I arrived. 4 students were already waiting. You can see ing. If you have ing, you use the imperfect. So I would use the imperfect here. 1 was Paul Johnson. Was is a state of being verb. And so and there's nothing in my sentence that shows a definite beginning or end, and so I would put that into the imperfect. I grumbled to myself because he came to see me before class nearly every day. Grumbled is an action verb, and there's nothing in there that implies that it happened repeatedly, so I put grumbled into the preterit. Here, though, he came to see me before class nearly every day. Came is an action verb, but I have nearly every day, which is repetition, so I would put that into the imperfect. There was nothing wrong with his ability to learn. This is a state of being verb. And because we're talking about a generality, something that there's nothing wrong with him over repeated amounts of time, this would go in the imperfect. He just didn't study enough. Studying is an action, but when I say he just didn't study enough, I don't mean that he didn't study enough yesterday, he didn't study enough last week. I mean he, in general, didn't study enough, and so that would be the imperfect. Anyway, I talked to him one more time. You can see here one more time. That lets it be a completed action, and so that talked should be in the preterit. And to my great surprise, he showed me a very interesting paper. Show is showed is an action, and so there's nothing in there that tells me that he showed me this paper over and over and over again, and so showed would be in the preterit. And wrote, an interesting paper he wrote. Wrote is also an action, and there's nothing in there that talks about this being a paper that he wrote multiple times. He wrote it once, and we've got the week before, and so that would also be in the preterit.